And congratulations too. I was going to just say you had your son like this summer.
Yeah. Yeah, he'll be 5 months on Wednesday. Thank you.
That's really cool. Have you played any Elvis for him yet? Just maybe to put him to sleep or something?
There's an Elvis kids book, like a baby book up there that he's not old enough for me to read to him yet, but that's going to be one of the first ones. And then, yeah, he's heard some Elvis stuff around the house.
That's cool. Get him started early.
Yeah.
Yo, welcome to My Summer Lair. I'm your host, Sammy. I'm recording this in the ghetto. Younan. Content without context is clickbait. Content without context is clickbait. Let's use the DeLorean to time travel back to 1968. Elvis is about to step onto the stage for the incendiary 68 comeback special. Yo, I saw Elvis's astonishing 68 comeback special on TV as a kid. Obviously not in 1968. The TV special aired on December 3rd, 1968. I'm not that old. Still, that special, it was stunning. Like, raw magnetism, raw talent, raw Elvis. All of it was unleashed and came through the TV set. It was like touching an electric current with my bare hands. Even though it's literally called a comeback, at the time I didn't understand the comeback part or have the proper context for where Elvis was in his career. Though I instantly understood the 68 comeback special as a sonic manifesto, it was a throwdown. It remains a powerful artistic statement. To quote LL Cool J, don't call it a comeback. I've been here for years. You know these lines. Don't call it a comeback. I've been here for years. I'm rocking my peers, putting suckers in fear. Elvis had been here for years. Before the 68 special, Elvis was on the verge of becoming relevant, though. With the emergence of the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, Bob Dylan and many other bands were creating politically charged music in response to civil rights and the Vietnam War. All the Wonder Years stuff was happening. When he arrived on the scene, Elvis was controversial. They called him Elvis the Pelvis. Those hips and those classic Elvis wiggle moves were too much for the uptight establishment. And yet, he was cool. He was Elvis. After Elvis left the army, his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, locked Elvis up in a lengthy film contract. Elvis made so many bad movies, like a lot of bad movies. And suddenly, the cool was gone. Cool is like milk. You can run out, and it can spoil. As I said at the top, content without context is clickbait. Context is exactly what The Return of the King, The Fall and Rise of Elvis Presley, streaming on Netflix, provides. How did Elvis get to this point with the 68 comeback special? I asked the director, Jason Hehir, who said,
The way that I pitched this to Priscilla and the way that I pitched it to Netflix is that this is a sports documentary. This is about a guy who is down by 5 points with 1 second on the clock at the 50-yard line, and he has one Hail Mary to throw up, which was this concert. And if he fell on his face, that's the end of it for him as a performer. And if he connects on that touchdown pass, then he's allowed to continue as a performer. Not only does he connect, he gives what many think is the most indelible performance in the history of rock and roll on that night. So this, to me, is about an underdog overcoming odds and doing something extraordinary, which is what every sports movie is about.
You know director Jason Hehir. He directed The Last Dance, the famous Michael Jordan Chicago Bulls dynasty docuseries we all watched during the pandemic. Andre the Giant for HBO and Fab Five for ESPN Films. Just recently, there was Murder in Boston, Roots, Rampage, and Reckoning for HBO as well. I recommend all of these docs. Highly, highly recommended. Big fan. Honestly, this was a treat. I can't believe I got to sit down and talk to the dude. I was really all shook up. Still, he's a household name because of The Last Dance. And in this conversation with Jason, I draw parallels with The Last Dance and with Elvis and Return of the King. Jordan and Elvis are icons. I talked to Jason about growing up in Boston and attending Catholic church because typically Catholic churches have stained glass windows. The church immortalizes their saints and icons in those windows. In pop culture, we don't have stained glass windows, but we have docs like The Last Dance and now Return of the King. Documentaries are how we immortalize our icons. And even though it's like asking a magician how he pulled off a magic trick, I asked Jason to explain his fascination with these massive cultural icons. Jason Hehir wants the Elvis documentary to show how the Elvis special, the 68 comeback special, inspired hope during a trying time politically. Sounds familiar? The 68 comeback special concludes with Elvis singing If I Can Dream. And sure, maybe that's a Martin Luther King homage, as he was recently murdered. Or perhaps it's Elvis foreshadowing the next phase of his fascinating career, If I Can Dream. And maybe it's for the audience, If I Can Dream. Politically dark times, hope is always in high demand but low in supply. Elvis was a beacon back then, and he can be one today. Return of the King, The Fall and Rise of Elvis Presley is streaming on Netflix. Please set the VCR. It is fascinating. And this is my conversation with director Jason Hehir. Stephanie, you're forever cool and will never require a comeback special. Hit it!
Sound, the final frontier. My Summer Lair is an enterprise, a pop culture voyage with a continuing mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new creators and celebrate established producers, to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. And now here is your host, Sammy Younan.
So Jason, your new doc is Return of the King, The Fall and Rise of Elvis Presley. I want to start at the beginning. You're a kid growing up in Boston. When and how does Elvis come into your life?
Elvis came into my life when I was strapped into a car seat when I was about a year old, and my mom used to drive around in her old Oldsmobile station wagon and play Elvis Presley 8-track tapes. And the speaker was right next to my ear. And even as a toddler, I was a huge fan of his. I was Elvis for Halloween when I was 4 years old. And
wait, which kind of Elvis were you for Halloween? Like the white suit or the cape? Or
I was
the black
white suit. I was white suit Elvis. My mom did a great job with this. She took a pillowcase and she cut it along the seam, and that was my cape. And then she put little stick-on stars that you get as a kid on your paper in school. She put those stars all over the pillowcase. And then I had a white shirt with a big collar and white pants. And I used to have a big head of like blonde curly hair. So she Vaseline hair back.
Yeah.
So I had the big Vaseline hairdo, and I was 70s Elvis. I was like Vegas Elvis when I was 4 years old. So he's been a part of, I've been hearing his voice in my ears for the past 47 years.
Good job, Mom. That sounds like a great costume.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. So you grew up Catholic, which of course the Catholic Church has many churches adorned with stained glass windows, larger than life saints. That's usually like the vibe. And it's interesting because many of your docs have become our pop culture stained glass windows. Like we elevate our cultural icons like Jordan and like Elvis. Can you describe your fascination with kind of unpacking these icons?
My fascination, and it's funny because you mentioned church, and I've always had a fascination with larger than life figures and what they were like as human beings behind the scenes. And one of my earliest memories in tapping into that was asking my mom during church what the priest wore, because I grew up going to church as a little kid. Haven't been in a while, but as a little kid, we went every Sunday as a family. And I would ask my what the priest wore when he was not in church. And then I said, what does the Pope wear? And what does the Pope wear to bed? And does he wear jeans? Does he wear t-shirts? What does he watch on TV? What kind of books does he read? That there must be, I think even as a little kid, I knew there must be a human being just like me somewhere behind the facade of these people who are otherwise iconic.
Yeah. You want to know the Bruce Wayne of the Batman.
Yes, exactly. And the everyman of the Bruce Wayne, really, to take a level below that. And that kind of grew into a fascination with JFK and Marilyn Monroe and obviously Elvis and then Jordan. I'm a huge sports fan. So as a kid, I was always, I had my heroes up on my walls, but I was always interested in what they were like behind closed doors. So doing this for a living is really a dream job because all I wanted to do was not even make movies, but just talk to these people and find out what makes them tick.
Yeah, like going back to the stained glass windows, often the Catholic Church will utilize them to help bridge the gap between the earthly and the divine, which is a fancy pants way of describing what you do, for example, with The Last Dance, right? You cross that bridge between the earthly and the divine. So now you give us this like view of Jordan where it's not just on the stained glass window, but it's a much more intimate look. And like you're saying, you're unpacking who he is as a person.
Yeah. I mean, that's the earthly and divine is a much smarter way to put it than I would have ever thought of. But I always talk about it in terms of bringing that figure on your poster on your wall to life.
Mm-hmm.
Or, you know, if a statue came to life and started talking to you, that's kind of what I see in my head as the ability that some of these documentaries give us is that these people are willing to sit down and be human beings for hours at a time with a filmmaker so that we can show the world what they're actually like.
And in terms of you sitting down with these people, on your IG, you have a photo from December 11, 2019, and you're interviewing Michael Jordan for The Last Dance, and you're rocking Jordans for the interview. But a year before, when you interviewed Scottie Pippen, you had on Adidas sneakers. So do you have a sneaker philosophy for each documentary, or when you're sitting down to do certain interviews? So for this Elvis documentary, you talked to Conan and Bruce Springsteen. Like, do you have a sneaker philosophy when you're going to sit down with Conan or Bruce?
I guess I would be wearing blue suede shoes for this one. I should have been, but I didn't. None of that was ever premeditated. We wore Jordans as a crew when we interviewed Mike, because we had heard that even on his golf course, guys are sponsored by other shoe companies. He'll make them wear his shoes, and it's always a fine line between being a sycophant or being just kind of a pest, or like rebel's the wrong word because it wouldn't be rebellious. But yeah, the Adidas, those were just really comfortable shoes. Those were Ultra Boosts. I remember that was when I interviewed Scotty, right?
Yeah.
I remember those. I missed those shoes. But no, there's never any thought really put into footwear. You're trying to just make sure that what comes out of your subject's mouth is going to be interesting enough to put in the movie.
Yeah, so how do you, I guess I'm asking a magician, how do you do that trick? Which is like, do you have any sort of techniques or sort of like a strategy in terms of like, because the interviews that you have, either for the Elvis doc, The Last Dance, or any of the docs you've done, they define the quality of the doc. So is there any sort of like, now that you've been a veteran and you've got a lot of documentaries under your belt, like, is there sort of some sort of approach or North Star that you use when you're sitting down to talk to a person, either like Conan O'Brien, Bruce, or these kind of people?
Not a North Star, but if you have enough time with the person, sometimes you're given a half hour and you have to stick to that.
Mm-hmm.
I've been lucky that everyone who I've interviewed, with few exceptions, has been generous with their time, and I can actually have a conversation with them, and you know, then you get their true self begins to come out the more relaxed they are. Some things are simple, as easy as putting them and yourself in a comfortable chair that you would be talking in if you invited them to your home or you went to theirs. I think that sometimes when you're sitting in uncomfortable chairs and someone's very aware that they're being interviewed, that's always when the worst interviews happen. Or even kind of the goal, you probably experienced this too, is it's almost a compliment when someone says to you, wait, have we started already? And you're 5 minutes into it. You're trying to get them as relaxed as possible. I remember Mark Maron used to use that technique a lot, is that he would start rolling, and still does with his podcast. He'd start rolling and the person doesn't even know the interview has begun. But if you say 3, 2, 1, begin, and you ask where they're from and what they remember from their childhood, I think that signals to the subject, all right, this is going to be a predictable, chronological series of questions. So with someone like Jordan, or even like Priscilla Presley or Springsteen, someone who's been interviewed that much, the more of an aberration your interview is with them than it had in the past, then you're onto something, because they're so sick of being asked the same questions in the same order thousands of times. That's where the iPad came from in The Last Dance, was just kind of a toy to bring out that Michael could play with that would be different than any other interview he had done.
Yeah, I've noticed too, there's also like kind of, I guess, litmus test, for lack of a better term, where like you can ask your first 2 or 3 questions, and if it's a new guest or somebody I haven't met before, they're like kind of like got their guard up a little bit. They want to see if I'm like gonna ask something dumb, or you know what I mean? Like they're not sure where I stand. And then I'll ask something that may be insightful, or like, oh, that's a cool connection or something like that. Like, and you could see the shoulders relax a little bit, and like, all right, this dude's okay. He knows his stuff. And sometimes too, like, I'm sure when you've done your documentaries too, being a dude who knows your stuff, that also like gives you a little bit of extra credibility and helps you kind of get approved, like that Donnie Brasco approval, right? Like when you're trying to break into the mafia.
Yeah, I think if you can demonstrate that because all of these people are giving their time, and when you're working in documentaries, you're not working with people who are sitting there being paid and they have an obligation to be there. So if you can demonstrate to them that you respect their time, that you have done the research, you know their story, it's always great when they forget a date or they forget an outcome of a game or they forget when a record came out and you can say, oh, that was April 4th, 1968 or something like that. So, but if you demonstrate a mastery of the subject and you demonstrate a respect for them and for their time, I think that you're well on your way to getting some good stuff out of them.
Yeah, and I want to stick with your story as we get closer to the Elvis documentary, which is, I find that your documentary work, it lives in this intersection between this tense black culture and this white culture. I don't know how else to put it, like the Fab Five, The Last Dance, Murder in Boston, and even Elvis, Return of the King qualifies for that theme as well. Is that cultural tension between, like, I guess the black culture and the white culture, is that something you actively explore and are curious about?
No, and I wouldn't even call it a tension. I think that the differences between black culture and white culture are interesting. And I, as a kid, was I came up at a time when, when I first started watching MTV, black artists weren't allowed to have videos on MTV.
Mm-hmm.
I still come from a place in time where rap music was an outlier. Hip hop was outlier. Hip hop was kind of like, it was contraband in school. There was only one radio station that played hip hop for 2 hours a night on Friday nights for 2 hours a week. And we'd record that and we'd trade those tapes in school, this little Catholic school that I went to outside of Boston. So I've always been fascinated by any culture that's not my own.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that musically I was a hip hop fan from the time I was a little kid, and I was a huge sports fan and a huge basketball fan. And there was a lot of black culture in basketball at the time and now still. So I wouldn't say that I set out on purpose to explore that. With Elvis, it is kind of I am interested in the cultural climate back in the 50s and the fact that he was seen as so controversial, whereas what we see today, he pales in comparison to some of the stuff that we see today.
Mm-hmm.
But the very idea that a white guy was doing black music is so foreign to a kid now. But the fact that wasn't really that long ago in the grand scheme of things, that some white parents would not allow for Elvis's music to be played in their home, that interested me. And to what a cultural force he was and a cultural bridge he provided to teenagers of the time.
Yeah.
And kind of how that ripple effect, I think, is what you're looking at now. Those people who listened to that music and kind of rebelled against that segregation is the reason why I am able to do the kind of some of the stuff that I do now.
That ripple effect you're talking about, it's come all the way now to rap music, right? Where it's still the same kind of fear, like this rap music is going to poison our kids, or like it's scary to people. It was the same fears that were like a lot of the same fears that were motivating like the criticism of Elvis. It's scary to people when they kind of adopt this culture and make it more mainstream.
I think the unknown is always scary to people. And there's going to be, I just had a son 5 months ago, and I'm sure he's going to be listening to music when he's 14 years old that I don't understand and I think might not be the right thing for him to listen to. I don't know if it's steeped so much in race these days as it is just being old and that young people, I had a public poster on my wall when I was like 13 years old. And my parents don't have a racist bone in their body. It's not that they didn't understand it because Chuck D and Flavor Flav are black. It was just that who's this guy with the gold teeth and the hat on sideways and a clock around his neck? What is that music? I think, but they weren't threatened by it. They didn't think that I was going to, do something horrible because I was listening to that music. But there's always going to be, that's part of what rock and roll is. And rock and roll, hip hop, I kind of put that all in the same bucket as just kids rebelling by listening to music and participating in a culture. And that's going to be the case with my great-great-grandkids are going to be listening to something that pisses off my great-grandkids,
It's a nice cycle. And I want to stick with bad guys for a little bit because inadvertently Bulls GM Jerry Krause became the villain of The Last Dance. I don't think that's fair, but that's kind of what ended up happening with a lot of the criticism. With Elvis, Colonel Tom Parker occupies a similar narrative in a sense. Organizations win championships. He's got that same kind of vibe. Is it too glib to say that the Colonel is quote unquote the bad guy, or how do you frame the Colonel?
No, it's not. But I don't see a parallel between Krause and Colonel, because Krause, I think he was greedy for credit, and the Colonel was greedy for money. I don't think the Colonel ever wanted to be given credit for being a great artist or for being the brains behind Elvis Presley.
Hmm.
Like he was happy to sit in the background as long as the money was rolling in. He played that character well, and I think he was a gregarious, charismatic guy, and certainly he sold newspapers whenever he was in them. But again, he was greedy for money, and Krause was greedy for credit.
Yeah.
And both men let that greed guide them in ways that didn't service their basketball team or the artist that they were managing.
Which is interesting because, like, even though you said like it didn't service Elvis, and there was a period, and it's covered in your documentary, where he's kind of doing terrible movies after a certain point. If you don't have that stretch of terrible movies, you don't have that setup and the high of the comeback special. You know what I mean? You needed to go down to do the comeback special. So that's why I was asking if you see him as the villain or not, because it's like it may not have been the best like business plan, quote unquote business plan, for him to go and to kind of grind Elvis down to do all these cheesy movies. But if you didn't do those cheesy movies, you don't have the powerful impact of the '68 special.
Yeah, but it's like what Billy Corgan said, is that it's a shame that there weren't more of these moments. For 7 years, he didn't step on a stage, and I still read the Colonel for that, because the Colonel was the one who was keeping him in these movies and keeping him off the stages, and the Colonel must have known that this would have been fantastic for him to keep performing. He comes back from the army, Elvis that is, and does an album that a lot of people consider his greatest album and his most ambitious one. He's doing operatic kind of stuff. He's doing the old poppy stuff that he's doing, and now his voice is literally deepened by an octave. And he's going into places musically and vocally that he had never gone before, and he was really excited about that. He finishes recording that album, and then he gets on a plane to go film Blue Hawaii. And he never looked back. He just started doing bad movie after bad movie after bad movie. So it was refreshing for me to see, because I had always been kind of disappointed with Elvis for that phase of his career. Why did you do all these crappy movies and not record the music that you could have been recording, especially when all these genres and artists were proliferating around him in the 60s? But the more we researched, the more we realized that he was kind of trapped in this movie contract, and that he did have an ambition to do more. And then he did finally have to put his foot down and say, I want to perform in front of a live audience. And that's what gave us this moment of the 68 special. So it was kind of tragic that he needed to do that. But, I guess on the bright side, the fact that he did makes for a great story. And that's what our movie is about.
Yeah, in your documentary, Bruce Springsteen, he's talking about that ambition that you're talking about. And he said his direct quote is, Elvis reached a fuck it point. And he starts laughing. And he says, Bruce then adds, he was going where the destiny was leading him, which is basically Bruce saying that Elvis put destiny to the GPS, especially with that '68 comeback special, and he was going to stop listening to certain people around him. And so that's what you're talking about in terms of like Elvis stoking the fires of his ambitions. Yeah.
Well, the fuck it point was very specific, because he did not want to go on stage. And he said that Elvis finally, I said, what got him on stage? If you can be in that dressing room with him that night, Springsteen, I said to him, you're one of the only people who's ever lived who knows what that feels like. To have that many people on the other side of a door that you have to walk out, and your career could go one way or the other based on this performance. And he said, eventually you reach the fuck it point. And with Elvis, that night he reached the fuck it point and just went out there. Going where his destiny leads him. I love that bite from Bruce, because that really was Elvis's destiny, to perform at the level he performed during the '68 special. I think that is the apex of his performative career. You could argue that it's '69 in Vegas as well. I think those performances were incredible at the International Hotel. And there's plenty of people, historians and purists, who would say that the peak was the Milton Berle show and the Ed Sullivan show, and when he really truly made a seismic difference in how music is seen and heard, when he did those shows in the mid and late '50s. But his destiny was leading there, and he let it lead him there. Meaning, as Bruce said, that he put his foot down and said, this is where I want to go, and this is where I'm going to go tonight.
Do you see any luck in Elvis's career, in the same way that luck obviously plays it plays a major role in a lot of sports championships, right? You've covered a number of sports documentaries. You're a sports fan. You know luck is important. And do you see luck in Elvis's career too, in his work?
I've never considered that. I believe that luck plays an enormous role in everybody's career and in everybody's life. I get asked a lot of times by students and younger filmmakers, how do I how do I get to a point where I'm making documentaries and that's what I do for a living. A lot of it is luck. A lot of it is when you were born and when you happened to go to school and when you bumped into a person who gave you your first job. But being prepared for that luck, being prepared for those opportunities, that's the difference. Is preparation and just keeping your head down and waiting for that moment. With Elvis, I mean, he did so much on his own. He is the guy who walked in and recorded that song when he was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And he is the one who decided, I don't want to be a truck driver. And he is the one who said, I don't want to sound like anybody else. I want to sound like this.
Going back to his ambitions again.
Yeah, this is back to 1953. I mean, he also, we didn't get into the 50s a lot. Fascinated by all phases of Elvis's short life just because it was so exceptional. But there's that, the legend out there that he recorded a song for his mother when he was 18 years old for her birthday, and someone heard something in him. He wanted to be who he became from the time he was a little boy.
Mm-hmm.
He was performing concerts in the projects in Memphis for people who lived in the projects with him when he was 10 years old at birthday parties. He always wanted to be the Elvis Presley that he became. I don't think he could have seen what Elvis Presley would have meant to the culture, or TV wasn't even around when he was 10 years old. But yeah, luck, who knows? There's a million questions I would love to ask him, and that certainly would be one of them.
Yeah, that's one of the fascinating aspects of Return of the King, is that the 68 comeback special essentially means Elvis is an underdog. Like, after all the hits and TV performances on Ed Sullivan, you mentioned, and Hollywood movies, and I know some of them bombed, but he's still making Hollywood movies. To do the 68 special, he's basically an underdog. It's strange to have that level of success and still be an underdog.
Well, by the time he did that special, though, that everything had dried up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the studios didn't want to offer him multi-picture deals anymore. The record sales, which had previously had skyrocketed as promotions for his films, the soundtracks did great and the films did great. Blue Hawaii was a hit movie. It was one of the top 10 movies of 1962, 61 or 62. I forget now when it came out. But Blue Hawaii, the soundtrack, stayed at number one for 20 weeks. That was a number one album in the country for 20 weeks in a row.
Which is impressive.
Soundtrack.
Yeah.
One artist. It wasn't a compilation soundtrack. It was one artist singing mostly songs about Hawaii with Hawaiian cultural spin to it. So yeah, he was dominant, and he was the highest paid movie star in America by the time the mid 60s hit. As Wright Thompson pointed out, more than Gregory Peck and more than, some of the other Steve McQueen and some of the other icons of cinema. But by the time 67, 68 rolled around, he really was pretty much at the end of his rope. So the way that I pitched this to Priscilla and the way that I pitched it to Netflix is that this is a sports documentary. This is about a guy who is down by 5 points with 1 second on the clock at the 50-yard line, and he has one Hail Mary to throw up, which was this concert. And if he fell on his face, that's the end of it for him as a performer. And if he connects on that touchdown pass, then he's allowed to continue as a performer. Not only does he connect, he gives what many think is the most indelible performance in the history of rock and roll on that night. So this, to me, is about an underdog overcoming odds and doing something extraordinary, which is what every sports movie is about.
Yeah. And it's the inspiration, right? The destiny that we were talking about. This is where it comes from, right? Because it's it almost feels fated. When you look back at sports documentaries or The Last Dance or whatever, it almost feels like this was fate. Like the player caught the ball at the right moment, or Jordan hit this shot, or whatever it may be. It always feels fated.
Yeah. The best accomplishments feel like they were destined to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, none of them were. And all of them took an extraordinary amount of hard work to get to that moment. You could say Michael was meant to hit that shot against the Jazz in the 98 finals, the final shot of his Bulls career and the final shot of the Bulls dynasty. Well, you can point to the 10 episodes of The Last Dance to show that a lot of work goes into that one moment. And I'm not a believer in destiny. I'm not a believer in fate. I think that you make your own destiny, you make your own fate through hard work and through perseverance. So the idea that people think that a lot of these extraordinary people are born the way they are, no one's born the way they are as an adult. They become that. And just about every person you can think of who is now iconized in our culture as a statue or a poster or an immortal, be they in sports or arts and entertainment, they went through an extraordinary amount of hardship and hard work to get to where they got. So to be able to tell that side of those stories goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, which is kind of getting at the humanity behind the statue.
Yeah, we're wrapping up now, but I want to touch upon the humans that you have in this doc, because Bruce Springsteen, that makes sense, but I was surprised by Conan and Billy Corgan. And I know sometimes the documentary is dependent on like who says yes and who says no, so I get that part. But where did the kind of, I guess, inspirations, if we're talking about inspiration, where did the inspiration for Conan O'Brien and Billy Corgan come from?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Wright Thompson, who was a good friend of mine, a gifted writer and a gifted just kind of culture commentarian, he was part of this project from the inception, and he's a talking head in the doc. He put me onto the fact that Billy Corgan was good friends with Lisa Marie Presley and spoke at her funeral a couple of years ago. And he put me on to this appearance that Billy had on the Howard Stern show where he was talking about Elvis and Elvis's talent as a musician.
Mm-hmm.
So it became very apparent. I didn't realize what a great interview Billy Corgan is.
He was amazing in the doc.
And I didn't realize what an Elvis historian and Elvis expert he is. We all know that he's a musical savant and he can talk his terms. But he also knew an extraordinary amount about Elvis's career and also could identify with being someone who was at the top, whose fame and popularity dwindled a bit. And he was very candid about that. So that's where that came from. Was we have Wright Thompson to thank for that. And then with Conan, I've been an avid listener of his podcast and a viewer of his television show from the time he came on the air. And I know that he is kind of he's a really good guitarist. And he has said in the past in interviews that if he could have any job, it would be guitarist in a bluegrass band. And I knew that he had an affinity for a lot of Elvis's early bluegrass stuff, especially the Sun record sessions. And he's spoken about Elvis on and off the stage, Elvis, many, many times in his podcasts. So when we were trying to think of people who would be good interviews, who would be unexpected, not the usual suspects with the litany of Elvis docs that are out there now, I kind of threw a Hail Mary. Speaking of Hail Marys, I threw a Hail Mary to him and wrote an email through his talent booker at the podcast, and got an email back that he loved the subject and was willing to be interviewed. So we went out there, and it's honestly, it might be the best experience I've ever had with an interview subject and someone I truly admired, both as a comedian and as a person. When Conan is being deadly serious about things that actually matter to the culture and to society, he's actually someone who I feel like I share a lot in common with philosophically. So to meet him, he couldn't have been more welcoming to us. We were told half hour with him, and he said, "I've cleared my schedule. You have as long as you want." I think we went for a couple of hours. And
that's a nice feeling too.
It's one of those guys where it's, they say don't meet your heroes. So he was the opposite.
And two questions just to wrap up, but one of them is Priscilla. I know that the focus was Elvis, and you talked to her on camera about Elvis a lot. But did you ever, like off camera, ask her about Naked Gun? Those movies are classics.
No, I didn't. And I loved her in Naked Gun. And she actually has like really good comic chops as a straight man. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in that movie that you can't not be funny and you can't not be a talented comic actress and still pull that off. So no, and I vividly remember watching those. Those are staples of my childhood, but I didn't get to talk to her about Leslie Nielsen or any of those movies.
Okay. And then final question. So as you said from the beginning, your interest is in kind of like unpacking this icon, this Elvis that we all know, but you wanted to kind of see the human side, the Bruce Wayne side, as we kind of use the analogy. So for viewers, when they sit down to watch this documentary, like what kind of Elvis do you want them to see?
I want them to have the same experience that I want them to have with any other person who we hold in regard as an icon. So an Andre the Giant or Michael Jordan. Whereas you see them up here, when you're entering the film, you know them. You may not know every detail about your life. The ideal viewer for me would be someone who's not an Elvis fanatic, but knows of him and is interested in knowing more. And he holds this pedestal in your mind as a performer and as an icon. And then we can humanize him and bring him all the way down to your level, to everybody else's level, to the common man's level, let's say. So that by the time he accomplishes what he accomplishes by the end of the movie, he's twice as high as he was when you first came into the movie, because you realize that he's someone who did something extraordinary, who's just like you. He was not someone who was born that way. He's someone who worked himself into being that way. And his accomplishments seem that much more special to you as a result of learning about them. So that's the experience I hope people take away from it.
You almost seem attracted. I asked you, like, what's your fascination with unpacking these icons, but you also seem really fascinated or attracted to hustle. That seems to be the other theme, I guess, from what you and I were talking about now.
Yeah, I always root for an underdog, and I always respect hard work and, as you said, hustle. And all of these people, Jordan wasn't even the best athlete on his team. He might not have been the second best athlete on his team behind Scottie Pippen and Dennis Rodman, but he was the first there and the last one to leave. Elvis Presley was someone who never, ever stopped recording music, even for himself through the 60s when he was doing those crappy movies, but just because he loved it and he hustled at it because he had such a love and a passion for this kind of music. So whether it's in sports, whether it's in theater, whether it's in cinema, and any other discipline, really, you see the same thing in business, is that the people who show up, the people who work the hardest are often the ones who are also considered the most talented, but that's not a coincidence. Anytime you hear about someone who is the GOAT in their particular endeavor, they talk about natural ability, but they also inevitably talk about effort and discipline and hustle. So yeah, I am attracted.
What you're talking about is Curry, right? Steph Curry. Like, nobody sees the thousands of shots that he puts up every day. But everyone just kind of says he has natural ability. That's one of the things you kind of see a lot, right, on ESPN and other places. And he does have natural ability, but you also know he's like in the gym several hours a day putting up shots. So
there's plenty of guys with natural ability. There's probably guys in the NBA right now and in recent years who have had more natural ability than Steph. But he is who he is for a reason, and it's not just natural ability.
So thank you so much, Jason, for The Last Dance for Elvis. This documentary is called The Return of the King, The Fall and Rise of Elvis Presley. It's on Netflix, and I'll put the link in the show notes as well as the trailer. But thank you so much for your consistent desire to tell these stories. You give us unique windows into these worlds, right? Whether it's like Boston with your story or like The Last Dance, things like that. Fab Five was amazing. So I appreciate the fact that you give us these windows into these unique stories.
Well, thank you so much for watching, and thank you for having me on. This was fun.
Yo, that was director Jason Hehir. The Netflix documentary is Return of the King, The Fall and Rise of Elvis Presley. And of course, I'm Sammy, host of My Summer Lair. Can we trace rock and roll reinvention directly to Elvis? Most likely, Elvis either established a blueprint or refined the blueprint. A man at the height of his power is seeking reinvention via redemption. Granted, what about the Beatles? You could throw them into the mix, right? Like, that's weird to go from the puppy love of I Want to Hold Your Hand to the stoner logic of I Am the Walrus. I do feel and believe Elvis is the celebrity template. Those early hits, that babyface Elvis, the signature leg shaking which created controversy and, of course, naturally elevated his popularity. Outlaws are always fresh. Outlaws are always an American staple. Elvis made movies and sang on soundtracks of those movies. Some of those soundtracks were also major hits. And yeah, many of those movies box office bombed. They were terrible, which prompted the 68 comeback special to reignite his career. The Vegas years, the tragic drug overdose death. And finally, becoming a dead celebrity where Elvis continues to make about $100 million a year. He's been dead since 1977. There are famous people alive who don't make $100 million a year, yet Elvis remains popular and profitable. Jason's right when he said these people aren't born this way. When he was talking about Elvis and Jordan and others like that, these people aren't born this way. Elvis lived an extraordinary life. We make docs about him and we make podcasts like this one about him. Dude he just persists. And it's partly because Elvis is cool. You know what else is cool? Well, okay. Cool is a very strong word. Well, maybe not as cool as Elvis, but My Pal Sammy, a Substack newsletter. Thank you to everyone. Thank you so much for everyone who has subscribed and left comments and thumbs up. The My Pal Sammy newsletter for this episode features a number of photos from my Graceland trip in 2018. Yo, I've been to Graceland. That place is breathtaking. Plus, it's Memphis, so you can get ribs and barbecue. Just a delightful trip. So yeah, I've included a number of photos with some notes as well from this interview, and that's at My Pal Sammy. The thing is, no matter how you feel about Elvis or his place in popular culture, and both those things are always evolving with fresh context, obviously as this Jason Hehir documentary does, throughout all of those changes and those evolutions and those debates and those arguments, one thing remains true. Go to Graceland. It's amazing. You can sign up for My Pal Sammy via mysummerlair.com/subscribe, mysummerlair.com/subscribe, or simply go to Google and put in My Pal Sammy. 3 magic words and you'll be checking out my photos at Graceland. Thank you so much for listening to me in a Netflix world. Elvis, yo!